Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Under the Microscope. I'm Michael Young. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be having a discussion this evening with the Minister of Finance, Dr. Ashni Singh, and we're going to be discussing matters with respect to the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering the Financing of Terrorism Amendment Bill and its passage through the National Assembly. Minister, thank you very much for joining me on this program. I know we have lots to discuss about the issue, anti-money laundering, and what's taking place in the National Assembly. Recently, you would have been alerted, obviously, that Guyana would have been referred by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force to the Financial Action Task Force because of its failure to pass the anti-money laundering bill. This situation is worrying, to say the least, Minister. What is your own take on what is transpiring thus far?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you very much for inviting me to
welcome.
appear on your program. And in particular, for focusing on this extremely important issue of much national importance and indeed an issue of considerable gravity. You are correct in saying that the CFATF, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, has now issued a public statement, a public advisory on Guyana, notifying jurisdictions around the world, essentially notifying the world that Guyana has not enacted this legislation, and in their words, that Guyana has not taken sufficient steps to address fundamental deficiencies in our anti-money laundering regime, specifically, of course, in relation to the legislation, and calling on financial sector regulators around the world to take such countermeasures as they deem appropriate to safeguard their own financial systems from money laundering risks emanating from Guyana. The statement goes on to identify possible countermeasures, including additional scrutiny of transactions, additional due diligence, withdrawing of correspondent relationships and subsidiary relationships, and indeed declining to do business entirely. The statement actually lists possible countermeasures. The seriousness of the implications for our country's image, first of all, and secondly, for the ease with which Guyana does business with the rest of the world, are alarming, to say the least. As a government, we consider this to be an extremely unfortunate situation, the situation in which our country now finds itself. But this situation did not creep up on us by surprise.
Okay.
It was an inevitable outcome, given the opposition's refusal to enact CFATF compliant legislation. And we said so publicly. Indeed, not only did we say so ourselves, but recall that every other credible commentator on this matter said much the same. Domestic stakeholders, the private sector, who are the persons who do business with the rest of the world, said, we are already being affected and will be affected even more so, and we're concerned. The Bankers Association and the Insurance Association said so in public statements. The diplomatic community reiterated the urgency of enacting this legislation. CFATF itself took the very unusual step of fielding not one, but two teams. A technical team led by the assessor himself, who appeared before the parliamentary committee, an extremely unusual step for CFATF. But so far did they go, because this is a regional body.
Yes.
And they're concerned about the integrity of the region's financial system. And so the assessor, Mr. Roger Hernandez, was deputed to travel to Guyana and to appear before the Select Committee, and he said so too. He said if this legislation is not passed, Guyana will be the subject of a referral to FATF and an adverse advisory by CFATF. The leadership of FATF in the person of the chairperson, the distinguished Attorney General of the Bahamas, also came subsequently. Met with the opposition, met with government, met with the private sector, and said exactly the same. We in government, not after these calls were made, even before them, but in addition, after these calls were made, reiterated our availability, our willingness to meet every day for as long as it took in the Select Committee to conclude this matter. The opposition publicly disparaged the concerns expressed about what might happen. In fact, you would have seen some opposition spokesperson saying the government is creating a storm in a teacup, crying wolf, and that nothing will happen. Well, you could scarcely call this nothing. Speak to the banks who are now experiencing difficulty and have been, in fact, even before this advisory, experiencing difficulty in making transfers of funds internationally. Speak to the expatriate workers who live in Guyana, whose transfers back and forth now take longer than before, as subject to all manner of interrogation. Speak to the businesses who find now that making a routine payment to a company overseas or receiving a routine payment from a company overseas now takes much longer and you have to supply vast volumes of information. But the opposition was disparaging and dismissive of the consequences and the gravity of these consequences that might arise from this eventuality. They must have been the only persons in the world who did not recognize how serious this matter is, and perhaps still don't recognize how serious this matter is. The international credibility of a country is something that every citizen must defend, has a responsibility to defend. The credibility of our country is at stake here. The integrity and health of our financial system is at stake here. But most of all, the livelihood, the lives, the well-being of individual citizens is under threat here through many channels. If a business is not able to do international business and it has to close its doors, that's a job that is lost. If an investor was going to come to invest in Guyana and he now has second thoughts, or he's no longer able to raise capital on the international markets or the financial markets, and so he doesn't come to Guyana, doesn't set up his business in Guyana any longer, jobs are lost. Or jobs that would have been created are no longer created. That's Guyanese people who have been working there. If a Guyanese citizen receives remittances and their remittance doesn't come on time, or when it comes, it is subject to a deduction because additional fees were deducted for the purposes of additional due diligence. It takes longer and it is costlier. It is the ordinary man in the street who is affected, not the 33 men sitting in Parliament there who have acted capriciously on this matter from the very inception. It's the ordinary man in the street who is affected.
Minister, there seems to be lots of blame game taking place over the anti-money laundering bill, and who is really responsible for the delay in its passage and all of these other issues. Before we address that fundamental issue which is now engaging the public's attention, Let us talk a little bit about investors' confidence. And I know you've spoken a lot about this matter and the fact that Guyana has managed after a very long time to bring itself to a position where it can attract, large-scale investments. We've seen recently the Marriott and several others. Do you believe that the non-passage of this legislation and the advisory now issued by CFT and the referral of the country to the Financial Action Task Force can have negative, debilitating effects on Guyana's ability to attract better investments in the future and even now?
Well, it is inevitable that it will have an adverse effect on Guyana's attractiveness as an investment destination. It is inevitable. International investors look for destinations to place their investments that have certain prerequisites in place, including the ease with which they can bring their money in and take their money out. An international investor wants to be able to move his investment resources into Guyana, establish his business, repatriate his earnings as needed, without impediment. When an investor sees that Guyana is subject to sanction by CFT and that there may be international banks that may be unprepared to do business with Guyana, that investor inevitably will have second thoughts about coming to invest in Guyana, inevitably. What is more is that most investors who are coming into Guyana, or indeed investing anywhere in the world, are raising capital. They're either going to the capital markets, the stock markets, to raise capital, or they're going to financial institutions to raise capital, banks, etc. These institutions have now been put on notice in writing by CFT that they must think twice before they do business with Guyana, and that they must do additional due diligence before they do business with Guyana. That's in writing. Those are not my words. Those words are in the CFT advisory, that a financial institution doing business with Guyana is advised to take such measures, additional measures to protect itself, including possibly additional due diligence. Those are CFT's words. Mm-hmm. So an investor going to a potential provider of financing for a project in Guyana has this to deal with. And so there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this development will have adverse consequences for Guyana's attractiveness as an investment destination.
Let's address who's to blame, Minister, or who should take a majority of the blame if you want to be a little more fair. The opposition leader, David Granger, seems to be saying that this matter should, and all of the responsibility for what is taking place should be laid squarely at the feet of the government because of their failure over 2 years, I think, to bring this legislation to Parliament, to prosecute persons, to establish a financial intelligence unit that is functional and operational and reaping benefits. And he seems to be saying, don't blame us at all. We're not the ones that should be blamed. Do you buy that argument at this 11th hour?
Well, I don't believe that any but right-minded person will buy that argument. I am saying very clearly and explicitly that the opposition must accept full responsibility for this advisory being issued on Guyana.
Why?
First of all, the records will reflect. When we took this legislation to Parliament, it is the opposition that asked for the legislation to go to a select committee. We took the legislation to Parliament with the intention that it would be debated and passed in the normal course of things. They asked for an opportunity to study it more closely. We didn't hold out. We said immediately, you want to examine it more closely, we will take it to a special select committee. So we responded to their request for it to go to a special select committee, which then involved the delay. It's not government volunteering to take it to a select committee. It is government acquiescing to their request. So you have there immediately a delay occasioned by an opposition request. But you have then the proceedings of the select committee, And if you examine the record of the Select Committee, government was constantly impressing on the opposition the need to conclude the work of the Select Committee in a timely manner. We said we will meet every day. We will meet for as long as it takes. We will make ourselves available at weekends, at the recess, in the middle of the night. We said we are available to conclude this. It is the opposition that always insisted on early adjournment of the committee's work, lengthy adjournment, so they can't come back until next week and the following week and the following week. It is the opposition that adjourned before the parliamentary recess last year and refused to come back until after the parliamentary recess. So the records of the Special Select Committee, this is the first Special Select Committee, will reflect that it is the opposition that employed delay tactics in the Special Select Committee. It is the opposition that employed delay tactics. So that's the second reason. Thirdly, when that committee concluded its work and took the bill back to Parliament, I think around October or November last year, government voted in favor of the bill, and it is the opposition that voted against the bill. That's a fact. That is in the public domain. It is the opposition that voted against this bill last year. We then went further and sought special leave, given the gravity of the matter, and resubmitted the bill. In this second Special Select Committee that constituted, they continued to employ delay tactics. And what is worse, and this is my next point, although they said they wanted this bill to go to the Select Committee, and although they said they had recommendations to make, they made no recommendations until February of this year, until a whole year had elapsed. And when they finally made their recommendations had nothing to do with the bill, but instead had to do with the Principal Act, related to the Principal Act. The committee was not looking at the Principal Act. The committee was looking at the bill. They were cautioned. They were told, if you try to make further amendments to the Principal Act, you run the risk of bringing Guyana into non-compliance in areas where we were previously in compliance, because you're now going back to the Principal Act and changing other things. They still refused to drop their demands and said the bill cannot move unless their additional amendments to the Principal Act were accommodated. That's in the public domain. That is a matter of public record. The proceedings of the Special Select Committee are a matter of public record. So they have displayed every delay tactic, every frustrating mechanism, every design to ensure that this bill is not passed. When you try to adjourn to a meeting, they're never available. For weeks the committee hasn't met, and they're well aware that the deadline was imminent.
Okay.
And they've maintained they're not, and as a matter of fact, if one opposition member is available, they say they're not willing to have a meeting. The government's position is, if one of our members is not available, proceed with the meeting anyhow, because the matter of concluding this bill is far too urgent not to have a meeting because one member is absent.
Now, Minister, several other things have been brought into the picture, apart from what you mentioned taking place at the Special Select Committee. The Alliance for Change is calling for the establishment of the Public Procurement Commission. The APNU, a Partnership for National Unity, says it wants local government election and a suite of legislation brought to be signed by the President, Donald Ramotar. And if these things are not done, maybe this bill will not go through. Do you think this is an admission that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the anti-money laundering bill as is, and therefore it may be a case that politics is now affecting something of national and public urgent importance?
Well, you are correct that in your suggestion that this clearly points to the fact that there's nothing wrong with the bill, but there is additional evidence, confirmatory evidence, that there's nothing wrong with the bill. The amendments that they have suggested do not relate to the substantive bill. They have no problems with the bill as it is. What they want to do is to piggyback on the bill to make other changes to the Principal Act. They have no problem with the substantive clauses of the bill. So you have that evidence that there's nothing wrong with the bill, and then you have the fact, like you said, that they're not expressing reservations about the bill. What they're doing is they're trying to attach political conditions to their support for the bill.
Is that wrong?
Well, I will tell you this, that this is a matter that is so important that it cannot be made the subject of political barter. Cannot be made the subject. This is not the opportunity for, and I've said this before, this is such a serious matter that it should not be the subject of political horse trading. This is a matter that affects Guyana internationally. You cannot make this the subject of political horse trading. The President said it quite clearly. This bill should be supported unconditionally. That is what is it.
The opposition doesn't hold that view, Dr. Singh. They're saying Public Procurement Commission, anti-money laundering bill. The opposition leader today reiterated the call for all of this legislation to be passed. How would you describe this sort of, I don't want to say it's not, I don't know if it is ransom, but how would you describe that in a simplistic scenario?
Well, it is political blackmail. And they are holding the country to ransom. The opposition of Guyana is holding the country to ransom on this matter. They want to shove down the country's throats legislation that is unconstitutional. They're demanding that the President should sign legislation that they took to Parliament when that legislation clearly collides with the Constitution. And when the Attorney General has given legal advice to the President that this legislation collides with the Constitution. The President has a constitutional right to withhold his assent. We didn't write that into the Constitution. There is a reason why the law says, why the Constitution says, when a bill is passed in Parliament, it does not become the law until it goes to the President and until the President grants his assent. And the President is not obliged to grant his assent. That is written, we didn't unilaterally pass that Constitution. That is not our Constitution, in the sense that, or only our Constitution. That's the Constitution of the country. That Constitution is in law because it was supported by 75% of the Parliament. That's not a PPP, a figment of the PPP imagination. The clothing of the President with the right to withhold assent is a constitutional construct. That is a constitutional right that vests with the President.
Okay.
And if the President deems it appropriate for reasons that he has provided not to grant his assent, he is exercising his constitutional right. In this instance, he has the formal legal advice that he should not assent to these bills because they will bring him in violation of the Constitution. And so to try now to compel the President, somehow to create the impression that by the President withholding his assent of these bills, he's doing something wrong, or the government is doing something wrong, is ridiculous. The President has a constitutional right not to assent to a piece of legislation that comes before him. And he's exercising that right. And he's provided the reasons why he's exercising that right. And you cannot therefore hold the entire nation to ransom because you want to force the President's hand. That's essentially what you're doing. You want to force the President's hand. The opposition wants to force the President's hand to assent to bills that are unconstitutional. And in order to force his hand, they're holding the nation to ransom by saying, we don't care which businesses have to close down. We don't care whose jobs are jeopardized. We don't care who is unable to get their remittances on time. We don't care which investor is no longer able to invest in Guyana. We don't care who is unable now to send money or to receive money to do it. We don't care how people are affected. We will hold the entire nation to ransom so that we can force the President to sign something.
And if that ransom is not paid, the anti-money laundering bill is not passed, Guyana is blacklisted. Mr. Granger says it will be the fault of the government. How would you respond to that?
Let me give you a parallel. Mm-hmm. Imagine a kidnapper kidnapping a person, a victim of a kidnapping. Let us say hypothetically now a child, a kidnapper kidnapping a child. And saying to the parents, I have kidnapped your child, and I am demanding that you pay a ransom for me to return your child. The parent says, I'm unable to pay that ransom, and does not pay the ransom. And the kidnapper turns around and kills the child, and then says, It's not my fault that the child is dead. It is your fault that the child is dead because you refuse to pay the ransom. That's essentially, that is the parallel. That is the parallel. Because it is the opposition that is obstructing the passage of this legislation. It is the opposition that is demanding something in exchange for their support for this legislation. And it is the opposition that is saying, unless you give me what I'm demanding of you, I will obstruct this legislation and destroy the economy of Guyana.
Is that criminal in your mind?
Well, I would hesitate to use that word simply because I don't want to exacerbate the situation. Well, I want passage of this legislation, and I know that they are eager to jump on any limb and any excuse. And if I describe it as criminal behavior, I know that they will use that as an excuse to deepen the rift rather than to close the rift. So I would hesitate to attach labels of that sort to it. But I would leave the people of Guyana to judge. I think the case is crystal clear. They are the ones who are withholding their vote. They're the ones who are saying, if you don't give us what we want, we don't care what the consequences are, we will obstruct this legislation, destroy people's businesses, destroy people's lives. They're the ones doing that. Let the people of Guyana judge. Let the business community, let the citizens who are affected, let them judge and say whether what kind of behavior they think this is.
Minister, there seems to be some confusion between this whole business on the issue of blacklisting. While you've spoken quite comprehensively of, some of the consequences that Guyana could face were we to be blacklisted further, I don't know if that's the right term, or if we were to reach a tier 1, 2, or 3 list, what is the country's current status? And it is likely, very likely, that if we reach the Financial Action Task Force, that there are going to be stringent measures and sanctions against Guyana.
Yes, well, I don't want to get drawn into the debate about what constitutes blacklisting. I know they're trying to split hairs between what is blacklisting and whether there's anything called blacklisting or whatever. The fact of the matter is that CFATF, at its plenary, considered Guyana's case and issued an advisory at the end of that plenary that is an adverse advisory that says the world should take notice that Guyana is a country from which emanates money laundering risk because we have not enacted the legislation. Had we enacted the legislation, this would not have happened. And the advisory says that. The advisory says Guyana has not enacted this legislation, and that is why we're issuing this advisory. As a result of which countries will take actions against Guyana. I don't, for practical purposes, I don't think it serves any useful objective to debate about what is blacklisting, what is not blacklisting is a term that people use. I suppose it means different things to different people. I don't think that really is the crux of the matter. If one newspaper wants to call it blacklisting, I say, that is why I myself have been very careful about using the word blacklisting. I speak to what has happened. What has happened is an adverse advisory has been issued on Guyana. And that is an indisputable fact. Who wants to call that blacklisting and not blacklisting and so on? That's a matter for them. But I am making a factual statement. CFATF issued a negative advisory on Guyana.
Sir, the way forward. The President seems prepared to have more dialogue on the matter. I understand on Monday he's supposed to be meeting with the opposition leader and some political parties to address the issue. And I don't want you to anticipate either what may be the outcome of the discussions that will take place, but is this the right course? Because people seem to think that maybe the government needs to be more forceful, but then the question is how?
Well, let me say first of all that we have always been willing to talk. We've never refused to have dialogue and discussion with the opposition, whether on this matter or any other. And that remains our position. We are always willing and available to speak with them. But the world will not stand still and wait for Guyana, as is evidenced by what happened yesterday at CFATF. And so there is need urgently for the opposition to recognize that the passage of a CFATF compliant bill is non-negotiable. We could put on the table all the other issues, and we could talk about all of the other issues and who is willing to give what and compromise and so on. But passage of CFATF compliant legislation is too serious a matter to be made the subject of, the phrase that I used earlier is horse trading. We will talk. The President is willing to meet with them, and has always been. We will meet with them. We will hear what they have to say, but we will reiterate our position very clearly that it's irresponsible, it's reckless to hold the nation to ransom in this manner.
Will the committee be meeting anytime soon, and when is the next meeting of the National Assembly scheduled to discuss this matter? I heard some suggestions from the private sector that maybe there needs to be an emergency sitting of the National Assembly again to address this matter because of its urgency.
Well, there is a meeting scheduled, I believe, for the for sometime in June. I don't recall the date off the top of my head, but when we last met, the Parliament was adjourned to a date in June. And in the absence of an earlier sitting being called, presumably that meeting will be held. It's not clear to me what an emergency sitting of the National Assembly will achieve unless there is willingness to compromise on the part of the opposition. If the opposition says that it is willing to support a CFATF compliant bill, then we have that ready. We can go back to Parliament tomorrow with it, next week or whenever. We are ready to enact a CFATF compliant bill. But there has to be willingness on the part of the opposition to do so too, and without attaching political conditions to it. Were there to exist such a willingness, we could convene Parliament in a day. That's not a problem. The problem is that there is no willingness on the part of the opposition to support a CFATF compliant bill.
Do you support, sir, as Finance Minister, the statement that by not passing this legislation, someone is protecting the interest of money launderers, crime, those who head the crime industry, the underworld economy, and those sorts of things? Because if Guyana does not have an anti-money laundering bill so that these people can be identified and prosecuted, it means you could have a situation in which crime, spirals out of control, or in which drug lords, money launderers, and all these people have easy passage in Guyana to do their business.
Well, let me put it like this. I have heard that interpretation. I have heard it said that the creation of this situation has that intention. I have heard that interpretation. I have my own interpretation. My own interpretation is as follows. I believe that the opposition is intent on doing harm to the economy of Guyana. I believe that the opposition is intent on frustrating any positive initiative with respect to the economy of Guyana. I believe the opposition is intent on derailing any project that will constitute progress in our country. I believe the opposition is intent on doing anything that they can to make the strong performance of the economy be undermined. And if you were to ask me, what is their aim? I believe that their aim is to seize political power. I believe that they feel that if the economy starts to falter and people start to lose their jobs and people start to feel that Guyana is not progressing, that somehow people will become frustrated with this government and that somehow they will be able to extract a political advantage out of the frustration that people might feel. And that is the ultimate example of cutting off your nose to spite your face. Because here you have a situation where they are willing to sacrifice the well-being of the people of Guyana and cause hardship on the people of Guyana with the aim of seizing political power. It is unscrupulous, immoral, and unprincipled. And it is the worst of competitive politics. When a political party is prepared to cause harm to the country with the design that the people will somehow turn from the government, that is the worst manifestation of competitive politics. You cannot say that you're a responsible political leader and obstruct positive things for your country and cause negative things to happen to your country in the name of politics.
But Sir, Mr. Greenwich has always questioned the statistics that, were produced by the Ministry of Finance for the economy itself. He's always questioned the growth rate, and he's always said that much that is being said out of the Ministry of Finance is a facade and that Guyana is not progressing. So he does not feel that the non-passage of this bill at this critical juncture can have all of these effects, like you're describing, on the economy overall.
Well, first of all, let me say this. Mr. Greenwich does not have the moral authority to speak on the integrity of any statistics. He does not have the moral authority to do so. It is Mr. Greenwich whose tenure as finance minister saw the non-production of audited accounts for the entirety of that period. Mr. Greenwich was finance minister from 1983 to 1992. And during the course of that period, not a single year of audited accounts was produced for that entire period. That is only one example of what transpired during Mr. Greenwich's tenure. That is only one example of what transpired. It is under Mr. Greenwich's tenure that statistics that are routinely available stopped being available. There are periods during Mr. Greenwich's tenure that the country stopped receiving data on inflation. And that data stopped being compiled under Mr. Greenwich's tenure. So Mr. Greenwich does not have the moral authority to question the statistics that are produced. Secondly, it is an insult to the hard-working professionals who compile these statistics every day. These people are professionally trained. They have the highest level of professional integrity. They produce these macroeconomic statistics on the basis of internationally scrutinized methodology. These statistics are subject to external verification, including by the international agencies that do macroeconomic monitoring. And these statistics can withstand scrutiny. Thirdly, the growth rate that we have achieved in Guyana is not plucked out of thin air. The entire nation knows how much gold is declared. It is not the Minister of Finance who announces that so much gold was declared this year relative to last year, or that so much rice was produced this year relative to last year. You can go to the rice millers. You can go to the wharves and see the rice that is being exported. The rice board monitors it. The gold board monitors it in the case of gold. The industry, the Gold and Diamond Miners Association announces publicly how much gold they have declared every year. Those statistics don't come from the Ministry of Finance. The banks announce how much their assets are growing, how much their lending is increasing by. Those statistics don't come from the Ministry of Finance. When a bank lends more, that money doesn't disappear into thin air. That money is borrowed, it is invested, it goes into construction, it goes into business expansion. Those statistics come from the banks. Every day you pick up the newspapers and you read about banks and insurance companies reporting increased profitability, rapid growth in their businesses. Those are not the words of Ashni Singh or the Ministry of Finance. You drive down the road. You see businesses being constructed, new bank branches, new shops, new supermarkets, new restaurants, new hotels. Those are not the figment of Ashni Singh's imagination. You go into a new housing community and you see thousands of homes being built. Diamond, Grove, Parfait, Harmony, Tushen. Those houses are not a mirage conjured by Ashni Singh or the Ministry of Finance. Those houses are under construction by real people. And they are real houses. You can go and touch the concrete and see it's real, and the wood, it's real. They're not a mirage conjured by some cheap magician's trick. So that is what the growth is all about. The new stores that are being opened, the new businesses that are being opened, the homes that are being built, the gold that is being produced and declared, the rice that is being cultivated. the sugar that is being produced, the fruits and vegetables that are being grown and exported. That's what's driving the growth.
So, Minister, you hold firm to the position that there can be a slowdown in terms of what's taking place in the economy because of a lack of investment. If this bill that is how critical this bill is.
I maintain that the non-passage of this bill and the issuance of this adverse advisory poses a grave threat to the economy of Guyana.
And you're willing to stand by that throughout?
Well, I think I really am. I'm curious as to why you would even ask me the question. To be honest with you, because I think that I don't believe that there's anybody in their right mind that would question that. Speak to the business community. Speak to the business community. Like I said, it's probably only Mr. Greenidge and his band of 32 fellow opposition members of parliament that don't believe that anything. I don't know who they speak to. I don't know who they represent. I ask myself. I think to myself, they did get a few votes at the last election. I don't know who they speak to. Because if you speak to anybody in the business community, they will tell you we are affected, or we know that we will be affected.
But they're also questioning, sir, the information emanating from the business community. They say the Private Sector Commission and the Ghana Manufacturing Associations, all that they say is because it's coming from the bosom of the PPP, because they're a facade, an entity that represents the interests of the PPP.
Well, they have had a historically uneasy relationship with the private sector in general. Recall that it is under Mr. Greenidge's tenure that the private sector was literally decimated, and that the entrepreneurial class of Guyana was essentially banished from this country. You might not be old enough to remember the 1980s, Michael.
I'm not.
But if you speak with people who will tell you about what life was like in the 1980s, from the period 1983 to 1992, you'll get a good insight into the nature of the relationship between the PNC and the private sector. The PNC has never believed that the private sector should be the engine of growth. It is under the PNC that the private sector was banished out of this country. It is under Mr. Greenidge's tenure that the private sector, if they wanted to get $100 of foreign currency to buy a spare part, a tiny spare part, they had to go and apply for permission for that currency. If they wanted to import anything, they had to go and get a license, an import license for special permission. So this is not a recent tension between the opposition and the private sector. The PNC dismissing the private sector's concern is not a recent development. They have historically, the PNC has historically been hostile to the private sector. Hostile to the extent that they destroyed the private sector and banished the entrepreneurial classes out of this country when they were in office. So this is not a newfound tension, a newly discovered tension. You are correct. They have no regard or concern for the private. They are dismissive of the views of the private sector. They are dismissive.
Okay, well, Minister, just your final remarks, because I find that we've discussed and covered most of the areas that I would have thought on the way forward. Maybe a minute or so as to how you'd like this issue to go for Guyana.
Well, Guyana does not have a choice. We have to enact CFATF compliant legislation. There is no choice in this matter. What is especially worrying, though, is that we are now in a situation where mere passage of the legislation will no longer suffice to resolve this problem. The advisory is there already. The damage is done. We should still enact the legislation to demonstrate that we are taking corrective action, because we are referred to FATF now, so we should demonstrate that we've taken the corrective action. But the damage is done. And I will urge again that we should enact the legislation immediately to demonstrate that we've taken corrective steps. But we will also have to do a lot of work to convince the international community that that we are worthy of a favorable review next time around. And the stain on our country's image, the advisory will remain with people. you know, and so regrettably, because of the opposition position on this matter, like I said, the damage is done, but we have to do what we can to recover the situation. I will say definitively, this government is available now to enact a CFATF compliant bill. We are ready to do so now, as we have always been.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. And thank you very much, viewers, for joining me on tonight's edition of the Under the Microscope show. I'm Michael Young. Thanking you for joining us and encouraging you to join me for more interviews about the anti-money laundering bill. Thanks.